Alright, good morning everyone, welcome to the channel. This morning we're going to run through a just chatting session. We've got a couple of, well, a couple of big topics. Hopefully we're going to get through them without too much hassle. I've had a quick double check of everything, so we're looking like we're good. Now, the first one up, first cab off the rank, is going to be talking about some stuff to do with Ukraine and Russia, or more so, there's some Russian stuff in general as well, but we'll start with Ukraine and Russia thing. Now, this article, this opinion piece article, came out last week, 3rd of October, so last Friday, and talking about the basically war economy and production. Now, I talked about this last week that there was an expectation that a lot of the media had driven that Russia was falling behind or unable to keep up with um, military hardware manufacturing, and that, well, they were suffering from material losses, they were suffering raw material issues and everything else. So there's quite a lot basically suggesting that there's a lot of bad stuff um, in the production pipeline for Russia's military hardware and supplies. So an article came out late last week talking about how basically Russia's in a wartime economy, at least is expected to be. Now there's been issues, and one of the concerns I've had with the whole sanctioning process is that it hasn't had the economic effect on Russia that, well, the politicians selling us on the sanctions said it was going to have. In, if anything, the sanctions seem to have actually hurt Western economies. Now, you could just say it's coincidental that there are other factors at play causing Western economies to crater, but the sanctions put in place don't seem to be universally applied either, because we had Trump recently having a go at various European NATO members for continuing to purchase Russian oil or use Russian sourced oil and gas and things like that, but mainly the oil. And so if you've got a desire to economically isolate a nation by virtue of sanctions, it doesn't help when everyone keeps purchasing. The other part that doesn't help is that you have to look at the global economic impact. Now, the EU, also America, obviously is probably the still still the world's largest economy. Russia's a fair way down the list, but in terms of nations that are still willing to trade with Russia, i.e., China, India, Brazil, a bunch of other places, you're looking at over half the world's population that is continuing to willingly trade with Russia. And you're also then dealing, you might say, well, okay, they're economically not that important. Well, China in particular has a very well well developed military. Um, they provide manufacturing for a lot of the world's products. They have a space capability, as do India. Um, and so you've got massive numbers of people in the world who are continuing to trade with a nation that's supposed to be economically isolated. And that is only going to be having means that the sanctions are going to have limited effect. Oh, we'll keep seeing how it rolls. But the point here is that, well, one of the other points too, I guess, is the economic sanctions are based on basically looking at the nation as having a similar economic structure to a Western nation, a European nation. But Russia's economy used to, I don't know if it still is, be heavily reliant on raw materials. And they had a lot of in-country manufacturing, onshoring stuff. I mean, the sort of stuff Trump is advocating for in the US, attempt to bring manufacturing back on shore. Russia had a fair amount of that already, either as holdovers from the Cold War, where they were never going to get Western supplies, or because they had the capability to develop themselves, or because sanctions forced them into that role down track. It's not like they were not known for having any smart people or historically for having manufacturing capability within the nation. Now, the quality of those products might be called into question, but they've had that capacity. So the idea that you can sanction a net exporter of materials in the same way that you might economically sanction a European nation, it's going to have a different level of effect. And if there's still billions of people willing to purchase those raw materials, you're still you're still going to have foreign you're still going to have income, foreign income. What's the name for it? Foreign currency reserves. So it's yeah, the sanctions, I, I economic sanctions. I don't know how effective ultimately they've been as a weapon of war, but according to the article here, Russia's definitely gone on a military footing and militarized a lot of their production. Well, given the size of the country, it may only still be a fraction of overall output. But we did look at an article last week talking about how the drone production has caught back up, well, basically it's caught back up or has been created and is producing enough unmanned vehicles to continue sustained, very, very, very sustained attacks against Ukraine at levels that weren't possible even a couple of years ago. So that's where this whole idea of, look, all this stuff we're hearing about the impending collapse of the Russian economy, the mass destruction of uh, oil facilities, things like that, it needs to be looked at as well of, well, if all of that is as it said, we should see corresponding secondary effects. We should see um, either gains on the battlefield, or we should see like a corresponding reduction in uh, levels of attack, that sort of thing, which isn't what's there. Now, we had some people come out and comment and have a bit of a go at that idea, and well, I don't mind that, but if you're just going to repeat what the media's already said, well, I've already covered what the media said and why it's potentially missing the mark. So this article isn't beyond pushing the fear of, I know Russia's going to roll west again. Again, I don't see that, particularly after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and even during the Cold War, when the Warsaw Pact was still around. Yep, they had definitely had an offensive capability, and yes, that was the fear, and that was the whole setup of NATO and everybody else was to stop the Russians rolling west through the Fulda Gap and everything else. And yes, they had uh, bases in other nations, like um, Cam Bay, for example, was a Russian Navy base in Vietnam. And but they didn't have deployed bases as much as, say, the US, um, who had basically shared facilities in Circlic. They had um, all their bases through Germany, through England, basically anywhere the US had been, there was generally a base left behind, but they still operated. And whilst there certainly was a very big expeditionary force capability developed, um, I think in hindsight, we look at it as largely a almost a defensive type establishment, something that was designed to maintain the status quo. And whilst they might have exercised uh, offensive capabilities, everybody does that. And the Warsaw Pact was almost, or the Iron Curtain, was more to keep the people in than to stop the West coming across, or to stop the East going west. But I mean, I guess that comes with hindsight of 30, 40 years down track. And yeah, so since the end of the Cold War, though, certainly with the 1991 revolution that Russia had, the collapse of, well, the USSR, the emergence of the CIS, yeah, Russia's largely had regional level concerns. Now, people in Chechnya and Georgia might say it's not really regional, but in terms of Russia's sphere of influence, it certainly shrank after the collapse, after 1991, after the collapse of the USSR. And yeah, the Central Asia certainly has a lot of Russian influence over the top of it. The Baltics obviously did their best to break away. Um, and Finland has always sort of tried to keep Russia at arm's length. But the reality for a lot of people living through those regions is there is still a lot of Russian influence, be it overt, covert, or just because of cultural ties. Same for up in Norway. The border regions are places where there's always been this blend of Russian and host nation type people. So you've got, well, not people, you've got of cultural exchange effectively. So Finland, as much as they're keeping Russia at arm's length, still has quite a lot of cultural ties in a way that link it to Russia. And the same for the Baltics, as much as they keep trying to separate themselves. And ultimately, so does Ukraine. And that comes down to then the whole post-Euromaidan, I mean, the whole reason for Euromaidan in a way, swinging back and forth between pro-EU and pro-Russia political intent. And then after the Euromaidan, you had the eastern oblasts that were very much ethnic Russian compared to ethnic European that decided that it wasn't for them. And so on and so forth. 12 years later, 11 years later, we're still stuck in a war, or they're still stuck in a war. All right, quick rundown. But beyond that, Russia doesn't seem to have shown any real interest um, to exert military power or demonstrate military power to keep going further to the west. If anything, they've kept mostly to themselves. Yeah, okay, people are whining about Ukraine. There's been the alleged spying events and assassinations in various Western nations. Possible. Certainly, certainly no different to a lot of other nations are doing or trying to do. So, uh, yeah, this idea that Russia's building up for an attempt to invade NATO within 5 years, I don't think it's there. And I keep forgetting to do this. Right, that's a bit better. Okay, back to the stream screen. Okay, um, yeah. So I, I don't see even in the military build-up, even beforehand, I didn't see the sort of um, even on a 5-year plan, the sort of build-up that would support an argument like this. And you've got when, for example, the 2003 invasion of Iraq took place, or even the invasion of Afghanistan post 2001, there was a very clear build-up, and the US quite obviously maintained an expeditionary capability, so did the UK to a limited extent, and other contributing nations had smaller expeditionary capabilities that they sustained. But even then, there was still a significant ramp up phase. There was not quite a war economy footing, but there was the question about how much capacity could be devoted to those sort of military capabilities for Iraq and Afghanistan. And the markers were there well in advance that this was going to happen. Um, when Ukraine, so when Russia invaded in 2022, there were markers that had been in place for probably 12 to 18 months beforehand, um, both in what was being said and in terms of military posturing. And one of the military postures that was the case was the persistent deployment, border deployment that was happening in southwest Russia, just across the border, basically pre-positioning. And that then obviously was the precursor that led into the actual invasion. That was where the military hardware and supplies came from. And it's one reason why uh, countries get nervous when Russia and Belarus held exercises near their border, because historically things like that tend to be precursors to people coming across the border. And even with the American-led invasion of Iraq, there was a similar sort of thing. There was an series of exercises being held in the Middle East, in the Gulf region, and people watching logistics saw a higher than average number of troops committed to those exercises, and a logistical pipeline, a logistical chain that suggested a bit more than just an exercise. And lo and behold, a few months later, everything kicks off in Iraq. And this whole idea of understanding the logistic pipelines and chains comes back to actually, well, it's always been uh, a thing. I mean, Napoleon said that, yeah, an army marches on its stomach. But in terms of modern era military understanding, one of the big things that led to, I guess, better understanding or better observation of logistic pipelines was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, they came across land borders easy enough and they had land supply chains. But what was missed at the time, or wasn't necessarily, it may have been observed, but they didn't understand what they're looking at, was a maritime logistics chain uh, leading through into the Indian Ocean, I think up through Pakistan, I believe, or maybe even in Iran. I'm not 100% sure where they offloaded. But basically, there was an increase in shipping traffic carrying, ultimately carrying military hardware that was clearly built up in the before before the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and it had happened over a long enough period that a careful observer would have been able to identify what was going on, and therefore had a fair stab at what was about to happen. in the region. Maybe not necessarily understanding which country was being targeted, but it was certainly enough to do it. And so that contributed to military operations afterwards, is being able to observe and understand, or better understand, these pipelines. Coming back to the article here, you're talking about an idea that Russia can push an invasion force into Europe, into NATO, within 5 years. Now, let's pretend that the all the articles screaming about military capability in Russia over the last 4 years haven't existed. Let's also pretend that the myth of a million dead Russians also doesn't exist. Let's pretend that the Russians' military capability is exactly as it was in, well, not exactly as it was. They're at full strength. So they've got a million men at arms, in essence. They've got their Black Sea Fleet. They've got their, uh, well, not so much a Baltic fleet. Yeah, I suppose it is the Baltics. They've got their full capability. Now, uh, their ability to strike into NATO is definitely there. They've got the ICBMs, IRBMs, SRBMs. They've got their strategic strike aircraft. They've got their missile capabilities. They've got the naval hardware in terms of attack subs and surface fleet and everything else. Now, we're assuming that they're all functional. So Russia certainly has the capacity in terms of raw military capacity. And I guess you could argue that some of these smaller nations would be overrun if Russia sneezed. Yeah, okay, you could argue that. But other than going into Ukraine in 2022, Russia's not really, well, even then, I mean, people, Ukrainian supporters may not like me saying this, but it's still a regional level conflict for Russia. I mean, they got mired in Chechnya and Georgia as their major conflicts post 1991. Yeah, seeing how those turned out, and I mean, Grozny as the ultimate example of urban warfare prior to, prior to Ukraine. Further into Europe, I guess European urban warfare, or the warfare that had been experienced, was the collapse of the former Yugoslav republics, or the collapse of Yugoslavia. And I guess you look at how Russia performed in Chechnya and Georgia, and then you look at how it's performing in Ukraine, and then you look at where the stance of NATO is. If they're afraid that Russia's going to run over them, then that's more of a problem with how NATO has, or the NATO nations have spent their military expenditure and maintained their capability, or lack thereof. The example that keeps coming up was, now I can't remember what year it was that I read the paper on it. There's a European Air Studies Centre, um, NATO Air Studies Centre, forget the exact term they use, but basically Air Power Studies Centre in NATO. And they had a critical look at the campaign in Libya, because it was predominantly an air campaign to begin with. And what they found was, in the lead up to it, it was originally a NATO campaign. And and America basically said, look, go ahead, do it all yourselves. Make it a European campaign, we'll hold back. And because, well, whilst America had done things in and around Libya over the years, that was basically an EU-driven concern. So the Europeans launched the initial air campaign and the initial conflict, and the reality, or the impermanence of air warfare, which is one of the characterizing characteristics of air power, was that the air campaign had, well, it had effect, but it was limited effect compared to what people were hoping. And the Europeans found out very, very, very quickly that their ordnance reserves got exhausted very fast. So the US was drawn into the Libyan campaign to resupply the Europeans. The Europeans still led most of what went on, but it was um, very much heavily supported by the US. It was a very, very good example from within the last 15 years of the Europeans trying to run a campaign on their own, only to find out very, very quickly that it was unsustainable. Then they weren't set up, they weren't armed or configured to do this. And this is years before Trump came along and said, look, you're not spending enough to sustain, to meet your obligations and everything else. Um, and so the Libyan campaign was, I guess, the shot of reality across the bow of people saying we have expeditionary militaries and capabilities and everything else. Ultimately, it was through the resupply efforts of the US that the Europeans were ultimately able to get the outcomes in Libya that they were after, and then everything turned to poo. More to poo than was already there. The one European air campaign or military campaign that seems to be mostly working would be the French in Mali. But even then, it's debatable how well their objectives are being met, and militarily, the cost to benefit outcome and everything else. Plus, it's a former French colony. With that, then, compared to the status of Russia, you then got to ask yourself, well, given the example or the reality, I guess, faced by the nations prior to 2022, okay, yeah, you could reasonably suggest that should Russia go west, that the Europeans lack the capacity or the capability to take them on. But Libya was an offensive campaign, not a defensive campaign. And so you're going to have defensive integrated air defense systems and everything else that aren't there. So, if anything, the ground war in Ukraine is the testing ground to see how well NATO's capabilities, because a lot of them have made their way onto the battlefields, have held up against Russian capabilities as well. Now, people say, oh, look at the examples out of recent conflicts. The None of them have been near peer, and that's the issue. Uh, Despite the numbers of men at arms in Iraq, they never really recovered post Gulf War One, and so, but they still bled the US really hard in 2003. Maybe not as the Iraqi army, certainly as insurgents. Afghanistan, well, bled the NATO contribution there rather well. Somalia, even though they were warlords, there was still some rather poor outcomes. I mean, the Mogadishu Black Hawk Down was seen as the impetus for the US to eventually withdraw from Somalia. If anything, probably the campaign in with the fall of Yugoslavia was potentially the closest peer or near peer combat that's been in the last 30 years. But even then, uh, the Serbians managed to shoot down an F-117. There were a number of other fighter aircraft shot down by former Yugoslav forces, and eventually it was weight of numbers that eventually overwhelmed. But there was enough to look at it and go, things aren't as clear cut as people would hope. And so watching these peer slash near peer engagements, especially when both sides had the same hardware in eastern Ukraine, should be concerning for military capability planners or theorists or work groups, etc. Because you're looking at a concept of not being able to overwhelm a supposedly inferior force. And this is just Russia. You look at the changes that China has had in the last 25 years, and that should send a shiver of fear through anybody who's considering taking on China or considering China as a potential adversary at some point. Yeah, you really don't want that to happen, honestly. So, back to the article. So, yes, Europe is retooling armies, not in response to what Russia did. They're retooling their armies because they ran out of supplies. They gave it all to Ukraine, and just like Libya, they found out that their reserve stocks weren't going to sustain operations. I've I remember hearing a number of years ago some of the concepts of smaller nations or independent nations with smaller militaries. What the point of the military was during a defensive campaign. That if there was one of the big belligerents in the world was to come and roll over the country, that nation's military, its role basically was a delaying action to hold off invading forces long enough to allow a coalition or to allow the bigger allies that they had to come and show up. And you're talking sometimes on a matter of 15 or 30 days. Now, that was using concepts in force back then. You look at how Ukraine and stuff rolled out, yeah, 15 or 30 days hold out initially. Yeah, that's maybe not the reality anymore. So, yes, Europe has had to retool. Same with the US, I guess, about supplying equipment. And, well, it says here Russia's obviously producing tons and tons of hardware. So they're saying, well, they're going to sell stuff off to China or Russia's um, allies as such. It's assuming that the hardware isn't going to battlefield use at the moment. I don't agree with this point here that the hardware being produced by Russia at the moment is destabilizing things any more than it already is. But it's interesting, and yeah, I mean that's a fair statement from Putin. I mean you'd hear a similar statement from any world leader attending their uh, military factories. Is that yeah, the demand for modern hardware doesn't end at the battlefield; it's going to continue on. You've got to prepare for the next war, and the argument that yep, the Russians are being bled of hardware starts. Well, you start seeing the holes that were always there. 400 armed vehicles per year in 2022, give or take, now making 4,000. Shipping 4,000. It's probably a production pipeline even longer. We had the article last week about the drone manufacturing in Russia. And yes, yep, they initially brought the Shaheeds in from Iran, but manufacturing 10 times the rate since 2023. And so, yep, okay, yep, expenditure, fine. Um, they're saying, well, maybe there's going to be a World War II. Look, I don't know. Um, the US, so the Soviet Union, Russia at the time, still was part of Lend-Lease, still acquired material through Lend-Lease. But again, as I was talking last week in the article about drone manufacturing, Russia's got the ability to move manufacturing deeper into Russian territory, further out of reach of long-range missiles and things like that. It's something that not a lot of other nations have the ability to manufacture in depth away from any front lines. Now, you could say, well, that doesn't work in the context of newer missiles and everything else, but there, there's got to be a way to effectively do it without um, committing war crimes, really. Yep, the Ukrainian conflict has certainly become a testing ground for arms and tech. Not new, well, drones have always been around. Even armed drones have been around. I mean, you look at even in World War II, they had early guided weaponry and drones and tech like that. You can look at this as an evolution of that fundamentally. What it has been a testing ground for is the capability against capability in a rough, not in a near peer environment, but putting up this Wunderwaffe, as people had called them, of Western military hardware against Russian. And the idea that you we're now going to see how both sides were going to perform, or the hardware was going to perform from both sides. In the lead up, or 2022, and even if you read a bunch of sources even now, there is no acceptance of the criticism of the failure of the Western hardware to deliver at the standards or the levels that it was claimed, or willing to accept that Russians either have an effective counter for a lot of the stuff or just work around it. And that's a problem for Western military um, manufacturers and militaries, because the assumptions that underlie force capabilities and force production levels and things like that are not as robust as people are expecting. And I mean, there was a discussion discussions going on, I guess, in the early 2000s about, well, what is the nature of future warfare? Are we going to have asymmetric warfare where you have overwhelming power from one side and not much from the other, i.e., going into Iraq and Afghanistan? But the lessons, the very, very bloody lessons learnt from out of those, was that asymmetric warfare isn't easy, and quite often it's the major military power that's going to lose in practical terms because they get bled out. And so that was certainly chasing things. Militaries were looking at future expenditure on, oh, well, okay, that'll be the main thrust of warfare going forward, and we can shape and build our militaries around that. I mean, New Zealand sort of could no longer fund a lot of their expeditionary capability, so turned more inwards. And, well, yeah, there was a bit of grumbling when that happened, but it was a reality of the ability of the nation to fund an expeditionary military with modern capabilities. Very, very expensive. And it, was it the right decision? Well, they're protected by geography. So, yeah, it's the Ukrainian battlefield's been very interesting to see how the hardware, relatively modern hardware, competes against relatively modern hardware. And yeah, I, I think in hindsight, years down track, people are going to say that, yep, it was scary, whether the claimed capabilities of both sides really did not come up to the standard that was proposed. And I guess the relative importance that is being placed on things like battlefield drones, well, again, those capabilities were always there, but if you just got to look at it from a point of view of, you got to find a way that's going to expose you to least risk and expose them to the most risk. Well, drones is a good way of doing that. So, uh, prior to the Ukrainian attack, it was number two world arms supplier behind the US, but using what they've got against Ukraine. But now we've got the thing here talking about the effects on the Russian economy, that it's emerging again as the leading arms sales. Hmm. And it's also the sort of nations that previously were friendly to Russia, still are seeing offerings of their equipment. I certainly know Brazil's got a mix of Western, Eastern, and natively developed hardware. Malaysia, for a while, had a mix of Eastern and Western hardware as well. So yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, foreign orders obviously going to be good for getting the money into the country, that sort of thing. And basically, in response to battlefield use, yeah, it, if demand hasn't shrunk, then that's a recognition from the nations that are willing to buy it that, yep, no, it performs to a standard when they've got the ability to buy from anywhere, really. And okay, increased values, etc. Um, it's just a fair bit of stuff. The other big reason I picked up this is not just because it's talking about, oh, yep, Russia's actually got capability. Some of the comments, I tend not to read the comments on these on articles. They, yeah. Um, so uh, Russia's producing capability now, and people saying, well, we've got capability that may arrive down track. Okay, people who anti-Russian comments. Okay, the obviously, yeah, people are still saying, look, hang on, the whole idea of NATO encroachment may not seem like much to people in the West, but it's important to Russia. And so, yeah, um, people say, oh no, we're going to keep doing. Yep, the NATO, the laser system developed out of Australia. Um, people, complaining about things. Okay, just everything's dysfunctional. Random commenters, etc. Oh, yep. Okay, they're building a lot of stuff, but it's reportedly poorly made. Okay, well, poorly made Russian equipment is holding the NATO supplied equipment at bay. What does that say? And that's the thing. It's like here's one of these disconnected thoughts or disconnected from reality. Okay, we will buy the first part of the statement as being true, which is that the Russian equipment being used in Ukraine is poorly made, poorly manufactured. In which case, you'd expect a remotely capable opposing force to steamroll. But that's not what's being seen on the battlefield. The battlefield hasn't moved, it's static, if anything. So, if Russia's not investing in developing a quality modern product, what does that mean for the forces or the equipment being used against them? Yeah. So, opinion that doesn't seem to be matched up with the reality of what's going on. Um, Here we go. Regardless of what we've been told, Russian weapons have proven the equal of Western weapons. This is a big problem because the Russians can build equivalent platforms at 40% of the cost of Western weapons are being sold at. They also come with no strings attached like the US weapons do. If you buy US, you virtually have to ask permission to use it or to on-sell it. Yeah, third-party sales. An almighty crash in profits from US arms manufacturers will be the result. Okay, I don't buy that last part. I mean, nations who buy US aren't about to immediately turn around and buy Russian. Now, some will, but they generally don't have the amount of money being invested into US arms manufacturing that is going to cause a crash. But the greater point still stands that it looks like Russia is able to produce an ability to hold Western hardware at bay at a much reduced cost. And when you look at military manufacturing concepts, a nation that can do that, or a side that can do that, is one that ultimately is going to win because they will outlast financially your opponent. Your opponent. So BRICS are the nations that are most rapidly developing, according to this commenter. They're becoming customers, obviously, for military hardware. I won't say that they've been traditionally NATO in Europe. Okay, Brazil, Russia, not Russia. Okay, that's definitely not. Indonesia is in India and Indonesia. India had a mix of Western and Russian hardware, but now develops a lot of its own. C, if we're going to look at C as being China, well, they developed their own, but they largely borrowed and copied Russian material to begin with. S being Spain, maybe. Not sure. Sure who the S is. I mean, Brazil also have their own developed materials. Indonesia had both, but certainly made a move towards American supplied material in the 90s, I think. And so, yeah, you've got, I don't say that they've been traditionally US NATO hardware, but yep, the former Warsaw Pact nations, so yeah, the Baltics and everyone else have largely bought in on Western supplies. I mean, I think Germany is now completely Western in hardware. I think they got rid of their last MiGs, I think, or they've retired them. And so, yeah, the communist is basically saying that you're running out of new markets, and the problem is, well, where does it go? Yeah, okay, Ukraine's Jack in the Box tanks. Doesn't matter if they're doing the job. And the idea that here you talk about cost of expenditure, the cost of the war, and they're saying that the Russian expenditure, what matches what the UK US submarine purchase is supposed to be. Yeah, you talk about value for money. Um, well, the submarines are going to be cool when we get them, but the point is, I don't think. I mean, if that figure is completely accurate, then that's mind blowing. Then again, I see that as another reason Russia's position is a lot stronger in this conflict than people give them credit for. Um, yeah, okay, they fear China. I don't think they fear China. Okay, if Russia is stuck in a stalemate with Ukraine, how can it possibly win against most of the European countries, let alone a united Europe? This person misses the point. How can a united Europe, if there is such a thing, hold against Russia, when all they can do is hold Russia to a stalemate? So this commenter comes back again. An interesting change in narrative, one that probably represents reality this time. For 3 years, we've been reading that Russia's military capabilities were a house of cards, that its soldiers substituted shovels for absent guns, that artillery shells and missiles were critically absent, that washing machines were being cannibalized for chips to make missiles, that its soldiers were hungry and freezing, that its entire military was close to collapse, as was its economy. All it needed was more weaponry and money for Ukraine to realize Russia's military demise. Well, that's a pretty decent summary of how the media's been the last few years. Only a few days ago, so last week, Trump described Russia as a paper tiger. The point of the commenter is that it is exactly that inaccurate assessment has prolonged a war that has laid waste to Ukraine. not unlike Vietnam, where the US public and politicians were constantly told that communist forces were on the edge of collapse if only another 50,000 troops, planes, etc. were deployed. Victory was just around the corner after all. This article exposes the folly of the assessments given to us for the last 3 years. Militarily, Russia is more powerful than ever, and its economy is nowhere near collapse. The acceptance of reality now brings into question why continue the war? It is not in Ukraine's interest to do so. It is not in NATO's interest to do so. So why continue? Uh, well, you don't want you don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Any rationale for not negotiating seriously has been erased by this article. And then people come out and complain about the communist point about Russia invaded, Russia continues. Why has it failed to subdue a nation less than a third of its population? Um, well, people again never paid attention to the casus belli that Putin put out. They still seem to think that Russia's intent is to steamroll all of Ukraine. Um, uh, Russia made it to Kiev briefly. Their army now litters Ukraine all the way to their starting point. They fainted to Kiev. They always were going to hold the eastern provinces. It was oblasts. So, guess how fundamentally how many eastern states of Australia you would give up if we invaded? Who's we? It's yeah. Sometimes I wonder why people get allowed to go on the internet to make comments. One way to get Europe to pay for their own defence, let Putin run. Well, it hasn't worked yet. Didn't work previously. Dear. Um, Now, we're going to jump now to some stuff that's going on elsewhere. So that's the main part there. I obviously Zelensky likes to complain whenever there's an attack, conveniently shutting up about attacks they're making against um, Russia. Look, for such a large series of attacks, obviously they should be targeting infrastructure. To only have 5 people dying from all these sort of attacks, it's the targeting seems to be quite good, which is another question about Russian capability. Is their targeting seems, well, by and large, pretty decent, and not just their targeting, but the accuracy of deployment. Hmm, that's that should be a cause of concern for people. Is that okay? We've been told that the hardware's failing and they're poorly made, poorly blah 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 blah. To Ukraine, I see people defending in bunkers and air defense systems and everything else, but for only 5 people to die as a result, well, you could say, yep, great air defense systems, but they're being overwhelmed and Zelensky's crying again. Um, he laughs at the West. It's silence in the absence of decisive countermeasures. You've got Patriot batteries. You've got all sorts of hardware. He says Russia's rejected all proposals to end the war, at least halt the attacks. Well, coming out of the Alaskan meeting with President Trump, Russia seemingly had a short list of demands that would be grounds for ceasefire slash peace, but it, Ukraine has rejected those proposals as well. Ukraine's rejected proposals to end the war because Zelensky's unwilling to accept the reality of boots on ground that the reality that people aren't going to like is that Crimea is gone and Luhansk and Donetsk are gone. They're not coming back. And you can bleed a generation into the ground. I cannot see them coming back, plain and simple. So they're openly trying to destroy civilian infrastructure. It's targeting gas infrastructure, power generation and transmission. What did you guys just target? You've blown up Russian refineries and factories, and we're busy doing victory laps on that. The major, I forget the name, Zaporizhzhia or something, the big nuclear power plant in the south of Ukraine that Russia's held since 2024. Uh, Ukraine keeps shelling it and then crying that Russia's putting the area at risk of, well, nuclear, basically. The Russians have shut down most of the reactors. IAEA observers slash, um, well, they are observers, I guess. Atomic Energy Agency people are observing and stuff, and there was power cuts to it when the dam was cut on the, and they, well, believed to be Ukrainians that did it. It meant that the cooling ponds for that power plant, the reactors, started drying up as well, and Ukraine continues to bleat that it's Russia putting that reactor hall, that power plant, at risk. Well, it seems that the Russians have done an okay job keeping it safe. Um, they mined the area, that's understandable. Um, but the claims of artillery being fired at it tend to come, the artillery is coming from Ukrainian sources. Now, there was a drone that hit the containment shell building in Chernobyl earlier this year. Uh, Believed to be a Shahed type drone, so looks like it was Russian origin. But when the Russians were up there initially in the early days of the war, they hadn't really targeted or damaged the power plant. So the questions coming out of that is, well, um, without better evidence, the claims Ukraine is making about those two nuclear power plants uh, cannot be believed. We'll go with that. Cannot be believed. Yep, combined drone and missile strikes. They're hitting western cities now. I still prefer the original Polish name for that city. Yep, so largest aerial assault in the cities and surrounding region. I don't know about that. They've had, it says, yep, they're considered a haven from the fighting early on. When there was, what was it, 2022, I think, early 2023, when a lot of Westerners were heading in to get trained up and stuff like that, and there was the set of images and video of a barracks where someone was playing a violin, and then basically everybody's all keyed up, and yep, we're going to win, yada yada yada. And then Russia launched a bunch of missile attacks because they'd been able to work out from the from the footage and imagery where that was, and attacked it. Pretty sure that was in one of these western oblasts. So, bunch of missiles, etc. Yep, strikes. Okay. Uh, Zelensky claimed Russian drones used in the attack contained components that are still being supplied from Western countries and various neighbouring countries of Russia. That goes against what that previous article had, and it goes against what the article last week had about capability. And he expressed astonishment that even after more than 3.5 years of war, it remains unclear how to halt the supply of these critical parts. It contains more than 100,000 components manufactured abroad from the 500 drones fired overnight. I really, Zelensky gets harder and harder to listen to. I don't get where he's getting a lot of this stuff from because it doesn't match up with a lot of the other stuff that's coming out. And clearly, obviously, he's got a priority but he seems to stretch the truth on things, which makes it hard to believe and support. If they're telling lies to people he wants to support. Yeah, over the weekend it said Russia biggest attack on Ukraine's gas network since Moscow's invasion began. So prior to Euromade, one of the reasons Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2, well Nord Stream 2 in particular, was built was because Europe used to get gas and oil supplies, mainly gas, Russian gas, piped through Ukraine into then European nations. And Ukraine was not paying their bills. They weren't paying their bills on the gas that they were taking out of the pipelines as it went through Ukraine, which is also, and so the Russians went, well, we'll deal with that by building a pipeline elsewhere. And so Ukraine's gas network, by and large, is heavily dependent on Russia. Used to be very heavily dependent on Russia. And the rest of Europe also heavily dependent on Russia. So the level of supply, either they're continuing to buy from Russia and everyone's just looking the other way. I don't know that there's enough LNG shipping constantly flowing into Europe to make up for the loss of what was coming through the Nord Stream network. But yeah, this is one of those things. I mean, yep, they're targeting power grid, they're targeting gas networks. Okay, people complain, oh no, it's all bad. Well, what would you rather they do? Target civilian populations? It's targeting infrastructure. All right. It's when I talked about last week the article about them taking shots at Russian oil manufacturing, you've got to expect a return serve. And well, Russia's targeting infrastructure and yeah, power cuts and everything else. So yeah, the military industrial complexes, yeah, that seems to back up with what Ukraine's saying, people who got killed or what got hit, etc. The ICC said strikes on the Ukraine's energy grid are a war crime. No, it well, the rationale by which you could argue that it's a war crime is that it targets a predominantly civilian infrastructure or civilian asset type thing. Uh, that's a fiction. I've got to say, it's when you look at these things, it's very selective in how they were drawn up, and clearly it's another weapon of war in a way. You could look at it in a similar way to, say, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation during the American Civil War. Now, that's held up as a great, wonderful thing of freeing the slaves, but when you look at it and look at the Emancipation Proclamation, it only freed the slaves in the Confederacy. The slaves in the North remained slaves until the constitutional amendment was passed later. So the Emancipation Proclamation was an article of war that was designed to further put the Confederacy into chaos by unilaterally freeing the slaves down there. Now, obviously, all slavery was bad, but it was not universal. Yeah, a person who was a slave in a northern state remained a slave in the northern state until the constitutional amendment. But it, the proclamation, great, set the path for the constitutional amendment, but in essence only applied to the opposition. You could look at an ICC warrant like this as much the same. It's, oh, there may be equivalent actions going in both directions, but we're using this as a paper weapon. against certain people. I don't see Russia doing that. And the SBU, see, the SBU, I don't know why the SBU is saying this, unless that then means there's some stuff going on in Russia that people don't necessarily want to see come to light, done by Ukraine. So, yep, they've attacked refineries, etc. And so, yeah, that's uh, that. Now, there's in the mix of all that, Putin had some public statements to be made. He doesn't tend to say a lot of that sort of stuff, but he seems to be focusing more um, at a foreign policy conference, talking about the US and talking about what he thought about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Um, in a wide-ranging speech, Putin also warned that the US that supplies of long-range missiles to Ukraine would seriously damage relations between Moscow and Washington, but would not change the situation on the battlefield, where the Russian army is making slow but steady advances. Okay, let's take that last part. Okay, so long-range missiles would not change the situation on the battlefield. That implies that he has, or he believes Russia has the necessary counter missile defenses for, well, I guess, broader use of ATACMS, broader use of the Flamingo, but perhaps even up to like a Tomahawk class TLAM, uh, maybe something more significant. The S400, I don't think they're capable of countering um, cruise missiles. It's more of a larger anti-missile system. I mean, the Russians do have ABM and anti-missile systems, and they do have CRAM, counter-rocket artillery and mortar capabilities. Yeah, I could see it. I mean, obviously there's still stuff getting through. And is the Russian army still making slow but steady advances? Well, you look at, say, Live UA map, which I think is actually one of the better um, sites out there that show the state of the front line, plus the reporting that's coming out from public sources. It's shown that, by and large, that is the case, that Russian forces on the ground, whilst they may be taking steps backward in some places, are progressively moving forward. It doesn't show a breakout type effort, and certainly as the Northern Hemisphere now moves into winter, the fighting season, as it is, um, across the plains of eastern Ukraine has sort of ended. So any expeditionary effort or breakout is going to be on hold until the mud season ends. Uh, Tomahawk, very next paragraph. Good reading, me. Yeah, so Tomahawks, I think the Russians can counter them, but we haven't really seen them used against Russia yet. And yeah, I mean, it'll be very interesting to see what happens with them if they get used. But yes, it would be a qualitative state of escalation. Um, yeah, it admits that they would inflict damage on Russia if Ukraine got them. However, Russian air defenses would adapt. And yet wouldn't change the balance of forces. Okay, repeats what he said. He dismissed Trump's statement about Russia being a paper tiger because of its failure to defeat its smaller neighbour after more than 3.5 years of fighting. And that Putin argued that Russia had faced all the NATO allies back in Kiev. Well, that seems to be a reasonably fair statement. Um, Again, that Trump statement seems to imply that it sounds like they want to steamroll all of Ukraine. Eh, we are fighting against the entire bloc of NATO and we keep moving, keep advancing and feel confident. And we are a paper tiger. NATO itself is. He said, a paper tiger, go deal with this paper tiger then. Okay, fair counter statement. Blah, blah, blah. At the same time, Putin hailed Trump's efforts to negotiate peace in Ukraine. So this first part, yep, the conflict, we're making grounds, we're not losing it. That's from Russia's point of view, that is. But we're still willing to negotiate for peace. Good. Uh, it, yeah, that tells me that Putin has, by and large, got the geographic position, the geostrategic holdings that he always wanted to secure, and now he's basically willing to wait. Um, Nuclear arms control, New START treaty. Yep, he's going to extend it, which is good. If they don't need it, we don't need it either. We feel confident about nuclear shield. Not a problem. Common interest, stern warning. Okay. While praising Trump, he sent a stern warning to Western allies against trying to seize ships that carry Russian oil to global markets. Now, the Shadow Fleet, I think they call it. He argued that would amount to piracy and could trigger a forceful response while sharply destabilizing the global oil market. Yeah, I mean, that's true. You, irrespective of what else is going on in the world, that is that is true. Now, I remember back in 2003, two, three. Well, well, one of those years. Um, wasn't 2001. No. Uh, the Pong Su affair in Australia, a North Korean flagged freighter that was involved in the drug trade and all sorts of bits and pieces. There's a whole bunch of stuff, but there was a lot of concern about how to deal with it once it hit international waters and stuff. What the implications of a military or an interdiction by Australia, led by the military, against a North Korean flagged vessel, not just North Korean owned vessel, it was North Korean flagged. So it was running effectively as a state vessel. And questions about did that amount to piracy? What were the legal rights of doing high seas interdiction? Did Australia even have the ability to do a high seas interdiction, etc.? But there was a lot of discussion at the time, a lot of concern before the operation was undertaken to actually interdict it about the forceful boarding of another nation's ships. And that, quite rightly, the North Koreans could have responded that Australia was engaging in piracy. Again, might has a right in international waters, to be honest. Uh, but Putin's not too far off the mark here with what he's saying. Now, the last time there were oil sanctions, shipping sanctions like this, I think it was like 2003 Oil for Food program, 2002, with Iraq, and trying to prevent uh, unauthorized oil sales out of Iraq and protection of other nations' oil shipping through the region. So, um, yeah, I mean, that is will be concerning. But then again, a lot of tankers and other shipping sails under flags of convenience. The question about the boarding of a tanker by the French military, Putin cast it as an attempt by Macron to distract public attention from his country's internal problems and mockingly likened the French leader to Napoleon. Well, Napoleon was effective. We'll talk about France in a little bit. It arguing that it defied international maritime law, it does, and risks triggering military confrontation. It does. This is stuff that has been rather well developed and discussed for at least 20 years now. And uh, it's Russia's not saying anything out of the ordinary here. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. I mean, Putin's not saying anything other way. Putin scoffed at Western claims of possible Russian involvement in recent drone flights over Denmark, casting them as part of a purported NATO efforts to inflame tensions to boost defence spending. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, just rehashing what that was. Putin dismissed Western allegations of Russia's purported aggressive plans against NATO allies as nonsense, aimed at distracting public attention from domestic problems. We are carefully watching the growing militarization of Europe, he said. Is all of this just words, or is it time for us to take countermeasures? No one should have doubt that Russia's countermeasures will not take a long time to come. Um, so the again, I mean, it's Putin, but you've got to go and listen to the words of people leading or wanting to lead because they'll tell you what they're going to do or why they're going to do it. Now, presumably the article comments are all like, it's bad, they're trolling, it's all bad. Those statements, though, watch that space, see what happens coming down the pipeline. It tends to be, yeah, I think. Now, you talked about drones in airspace. Munich over the weekend had it as well. There were, and they reopened not long after. No, no, we'll get to this one second, not just yet. And then there was stuff in Lithuania where it was balloons. However, it then came out last night that the balloons, which was in origin, were Belarusian and linked to organised crime or disorganised crime, where they were using weather balloon type balloons carrying cigarettes, black market cigarettes, and so being floated across from Belarusia into Lithuania and then presumably being picked up and sold on the market. Nothing new. So, balloons with contraband cargo cigarettes from Belarus are nothing new in Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland. So far this year, 544 balloons have recorded entering Lithuania, while 966 were last year. So we're in October. It's way down on last year. If anything, I should be celebrating it. Poland recorded more than 100 cases in which contraband was flown in from its neighbour using the balloons. They, yep, okay. Cheaper than drones for transporting. Okay, so they still then go back and complain about the drones in Danish airspace in Germany and everything else. Denmark said there was no evidence to suggest Russian involvement, and well, Germany and Norway and everyone else. The one possible way that could have been conducted, and this was potentially linked to the boarding of the tanker off France, was that the Shadow Fleet ships, and there was one apparently sailing between Denmark and Norway at the time, could have been used as launch platforms for drones. And so, therefore, these drones were then able to be launched and controlled from a relatively close proximity, as opposed to being flown all the way from Russian land territory. That is an interesting concept and certainly is not unrealistic and could certainly be seen as a viable means to do that. Certainly, the idea of using civil freighters, tankers, etc., as launch platforms goes back to at least the Falklands. Um, Ocean Conveyor, I think, was that the vessel? I mean, the Brits certainly had plans about converting cargo shipping into container shipping into Harrier, mobile Harrier jump jet mini carriers. But the idea of launching drones off the ship, yep, okay, fair enough. I mean, the I don't know who owns it, but NATO have put an air warfare destroyer in the Baltics there to, well, presumably see what's going on. So it's potentially where the drones came from, if they are ultimately linked to Russian sources. But a fair question was raised about not just the balloons here, which were linked to organised crime, but a major civilian airfield, several major civilian airfields shut down due to drones that were overflying. With all of that, with lots of travellers with mobile phones and all these cameras and everything else, not a single piece of evidence has been released showing anything to do with the drones. You'd expect that if it was bad enough to cause a shutdown like it was, there'd be someone with a phone or a camera taking pictures, particularly that far from Russia and everything else. I mean, when the F-35s responded from the Netherlands to Poland with the Polish drone incursion, there were many sources online that were talking about fast jets suddenly flying over houses and stuff like that. You'd expect there to be some sort of third-party independent footage or stuff on social media, but nothing's come up. And so that has led some people to start questioning what it was or what they were. It's like the Lithuanian balloons. It's like you've gone from drones to balloons. Well, that's weird. I'd suspect, like initially, with suspected, okay, well, it's something different. It's not related. Lo and behold, it's disorganized crime. So I now the drone overflights of military bases. Okay, that could be something different. You wouldn't expect civilian imagery and footage of that, but certainly the other stuff you would. All right, we've got. We're trying not to hang out on this too long today. The the UK is now whining about Russia's space capability. That Russian satellites have been stalking British military satellites. Okay, so the British have put military satellites into space. All right. Um, and I mean, they've openly talked about interference in space. Uh, that Russians have been jamming UK military satellites with ground-based systems. Yeah. If you didn't do that, well, I mean, the Russians know that America and presumably England are providing, or the UK are providing um, targeting information, intelligence to Ukraine. So if your military hardware is flying over Russia, Russia's going to take steps to stop it doing its job. So Russia's also apparently been putting satellites into the same orbits and flying along and having a good close look at them, which is pretty cool, to be honest. Um, Risky, because if satellites then crash together, there won't be a satellite anymore. And um, whilst, yeah, counter jamming, that's jamming from the ground though. He said the jamming activity was deliberate and the activity increased since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They've got half dozen dedicated military satellites providing comms and surveillance. Yeah, okay, so comms jamming, to be expected. Surveillance jamming, well, okay. He said, in contrast, US, China, and Russia each have more than 100. Combined Russian and Chinese fleet has increased by 70% over the past decade. He's whining that Russia and China have both tested ASAT weapons. Well, so has the US. I think they were the first ones. Um, and the UK and US have warned that Russia is developing the capability to put nuclear weapons in space. Uh, well, go back to the Star Wars space race. China is the pacing threat. Russia is the more immediate danger. Chinese have the more sophisticated capability, but the Russians have more will to use their counter space systems. Well, because they're engaged in the conflict. So, yeah. Um, okay, so I spent a bit of time talking about them getting rid of the old golf ball, radomes, etc., and back and forth and team sport. These things, the article, because the article, okay, replaced by a 30-meter, 98-foot pyramid which houses thousands of antennas. It's phased array radar. That's what it is. And it's fixed like that because of the way the radar works and where it looks and stuff. And there's no need to hide from anyone the idea that you're surveilling in the areas that it's done. And with enough knowledge about the operating bands and power levels and the aspect of the radar, they're steerable arrays, electronically steerable arrays. You get an idea of what it's surveilling and its coverage and range and everything else. It's, I mean, not necessarily made open by the country operating it, but anybody who does technical analysis of this sort of stuff would understand by looking at where it's located and everything else what it can do, plain and simple. But it not a surprise, shouldn't be a surprise to anyone what they're tracking now. How small a target they can track and how fast and everything else. A lot of that's the smarts inside of it. The antenna and direction will give a certain amount of capability away, but I don't think that that's unknown or unexpected. Um, ballistic defense, I mean, I think UK is still largely dependent on other places. And when we talk about integrated air defense systems, there's similar arrays set up in Poland now. Um, they had, and this was through like Jane's years back, they, in essence, chopped the top off a an Aegis class destroyer and glued it to the ground. It, for all money, is an Aegis class phased array radar was what they were putting in the Polish ground setups and using them in their air surveillance role, basically. I mean, that's the very rough rule of thumb of what they were. It's a bit like seeing the CRAM giraffe systems. Now, a giraffe radar is used in naval systems as well, where it's known as a sea giraffe. But for very similar points of things, you see a radar like that, and your radar, counter radar, tech type analysis type people, he will tell you again what the radar's for, its parameters, and all the other bits and pieces. But you're seeing land and sea-based systems a bit more interchangeable than they once were. Um, right. So, a bit of a throwaway here at the end. Here's a reminder why space is so important. Warn to leave the room if there's a real life incident while filming. An alert comes through of a ballistic missile launch and we are escorted to the exit. They are observing short-range ballistic missile launches (SRBMs) almost every day. In this incident, they will not say where it's from, but it is no secret Russia has been firing them regularly into Ukraine. Okay, so last week I said that it was not known whether IRBMs had been used from in the conflict because they're an escalation. And so I went and had a look. I looked it up and found an article from the US Department of War. Let me make this bigger so that people can see what I'm saying. That, okay, Russians launched new missile at Dnipro. This is November last year, so whilst it was still the Biden administration. US provides Ukraine new weapons. The Russians today launched a new kind of missile at Ukraine, what the Defense Department of War, is calling an IRBM. Russia launched an IRBM, the RS-26, which is based on their ICBM, but basically defueled and used in an IRBM one. Because they are capable of carrying nuclear weapons, the Russians were very uh, careful in its use. I would say responsible in its use by notifying the US. And like they've got these side channels that exist now. Yep, if they're going to be firing IRBMs that can be nuclear tipped, then they want the US not to jump at shadows if they see the launch detections. And the Russians know that launch detections of IRBMs, ICBMs are a real thing. I mean, they've been a thing for decades. And in fact, Doomsday Ship, which was a plan for a fully automated ship of massive nuclear weapons that had ICBM launch detecting hardware on board, and the idea was it was going to be autonomous, and so that once ICBM's launch of a certain size was detected, it would trigger the nuclear bombs in the cargo hold. Thankfully, it never went beyond concept. It'd be very scary to have it floating around, given the number of false positives on these sort of systems. So the IRBM was launched at Dnipro with a conventional warhead, and yep, the missile could be fitted with other warheads as well. Well, so can TLAMs and a whole bunch of things, and um, air-launched tactical nukes aren't that much bigger than existing GP series weapons. Um, so bolt-on kits and stuff, they're like a ATACMS, your TLAMs. I'm just trying to think of the other, your JSOWs, your JDAMs. They're not far removed from nuclear capable devices. B-61, I think is what it is. It's the nuclear airdrop nuclear bomb. Anyway, um, yeah, so it can certainly fit it. Yeah, it's an IRBM. So it's the first time a weapon of its kind has been used on the battlefield in Ukraine. So that's last November. So yes, it is an escalation. An IRBM and an ICBM have similar flight paths, high trajectories, and carry large payloads. So yes, you're seeing something go up like that. Hmm. Hence the notification to the US that this was going on. Then this popped up in the same article, and I was very, very surprised by it. Also this week that the Department of War confirmed that the US would provide to Ukraine anti-personnel landmines. Hmm. Uh, explain. Okay, what we've seen most recently is because the Russians have been so unsuccessful in the way they've been fighting, they've kind of changed their tactics a bit. They don't lead with their mechanized forces anymore. Previous Defense Secretary, they lead with dismounted forces who are able to close in and do things to kind of pave way for mechanized forces. In the face of that changing tactic, the Ukrainians have been manufacturing their own landmines to slow down Russian advances. They're fabricating their own anti-personnel landmines right now. The landmines we would look to provide them would be landmines that are not persistent. Well, again, in practice versus in theory, that doesn't always necessarily work. The Ukrainians have assured the US that the landmines, when they arrive, will be used only inside Ukrainian territory. They're not going to use them in populated areas. Yeah, whatever. Ukraine's lying. And we talk about treaties being broken. The Ottawa Treaty, which is prohibition on the use, stockpiling, production, and transfer of anti-personnel mines and on their destruction, known as the Ottawa Treaty or the Mine Ban Treaty. Um, Scroll through to the bottom. The nations, the key part here is the treaty only covers anti-personnel mines. It does not cover anti-tank, claymores, booby traps, and other static explosive devices. Landmines states. Okay. 122 signatories. 32 countries have not signed the treaty. The states that have not signed the treaty include a majority of the permanent members of the Security Council, China, the US, and Russia. In the 2014, the US declared it will abide by the terms of the treaty, except for landmines used on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea haven't used. Okay. Criticism. Um, yeah, good ideas, compliance, withdrawals. Okay. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have withdrawn from the Ottawa Treaty June this year. Saying that anti-personnel mines are an important capability, that Russia is not a party to the treaty and would not hesitate to use such munitions in a conflict with NATO. Russia has been using such mines extensively in Ukraine. Uh, Ukraine signalled in 2014 it might have to withdraw from the treaty due to military necessity. So this was when they were bombing Donetsk and Luhansk internally. So they were willing to use landmines against their own people, anti-personnel mines against their own people. Uh, Adherent to international obligations, ready to undertake all necessary measures to destroy anti-personnel mines in mined areas. However, this could only be done after they regained territory occupied by Russia. 2014. Okay, Crimea, maybe. Despite Ukraine not having officially withdrawn from the treaty, US President Biden approved transfers of American anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine 2024, November. That's that article, eliciting criticism for the rejection of the treaty from human rights organisations. June, along with these other Muppets, signed a decree enacting the decision of the Council of Ukraine to withdraw the country from the treaty. So they're in breach of the Ottawa Treaty to begin with, and now decide they're going to withdraw and start using it, which is a bad thing. Talk about capability proliferation. Dear. It's a after all the efforts to demine countries that have had extensive minefields and the dangers associated with them and things, it's disappointing to see a terrible escalation like that. I think that that is more significant than the use of IRBMs. There's still kids getting maimed from landmines even now in throughout Asia and Middle East where minefields still haven't been cleared. Speaking of nations that are considered more enlightened, I mean, that's what they think they are. When Yugoslavia broke up, there were a lot of minefields planted by the various belligerents engaged then. And there was ongoing work to clear those minefields after the conflict and everything else. Sadly, those minefields were not completely cleared, and there were um, periods of extensive flooding throughout the former Yugoslavia that basically washed the minefields downstream. So where a minefield may not have been mapped, at least known where it was, after the flooding, well, the mines could have been anywhere from where they were originally laid to anywhere downstream. And so you've taken what is already an indiscriminate weapon, hence why landmines are banned because of their indiscriminate nature and the fact you can't control who they target. You've now either prevented access to waterways or you've provided a risk to life of anyone downstream. And the idea that they're going to sow the fields of Ukraine with landmines. Now, I know Russia's basically turned Luhansk and Donetsk into fortresses, massive defense in depth, but and it got minefields and stuff laid out. But this is an escalation. Um, Even if they're not used on the grounds, the fact nations are withdrawing from the treaty is, well, I mean, Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia and Estonia, they're doing it because they're afraid of a shadow. Ukraine probably has a more justifiable reason for withdrawing, given that they're actually engaged in conflict, but apparently they were doing it in 2014, which suggests, yeah, yeah, it's not a good thing. Not a good thing. Now, last thing on Ukraine and Russia and everything else. I've talked a number of times about this observation that the public support for Ukraine is wavering from the protest class. And that you look at major sporting events, you look at major protests, and you look at the fact that these blue and yellow flags, or even red and black ones, have disappeared completely in favour of Palestinian ones mainly. The last night at the proms is a very, oh, kind of traditional thing, but the UK viewers or people who can watch the BBC would have been able to watch this online. There are videos out there, if you look for them, showing this year's last night at the proms from the Royal Albert Hall. Now, traditionally, what happens is everyone sort of gets dressed up, gussied up, and well, seen as a bunch of toffs acting like commoners for a night. But they wave flags and have party poppers and party hats and sing along and all this sort of stuff. But what was interesting, and out of this year's last night of the proms, there's always a couple of pieces where everyone sings along and waves the flags, and Rule Britannia. Um, they don't wave the flags during the national anthem, but Rule Britannia, uh, Land of Hope and Glory, definitely. Jerusalem. I've always felt that when the sounds of Elgar come stirring from the Royal Albert Hall, nations across the world tremble because it's the sound of empire coming for them again. But this year, there was a protest during the last week of the proms against the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, who had issues with a Israeli pianist here in Australia, and there were pro-Palestinian protesters in the Royal Albert Hall that actually interrupted the program, not the schedule, the program. They were removed and the program recommenced, but that wasn't last night at the proms. So I got to see, well, I saw footage of this year's last night of the proms, particularly Land of Hope and Glory in Jerusalem, and they show the audience because they're the two main audience participation pieces, and they're busy waving flags like crazy. What stood out was the breakdown of all the flags. There's a lot of Union flags, so UK flags. There are a ton of EU flags. Now, the EU flags were handed out by political campaigners outside the Royal Albert Hall, and for some reason were allowed in. There were Welsh, Scottish, uh, the occasional Northern Ireland flag. Um, Not so many England flags. Certainly, there were Union flags, so UK flags. There were Dutch flags. There were German flags. There were no Palestinian flags, and there was one Ukrainian flag. There were more Australian flags being waved in the audience the last night of the proms than there were Ukrainian flags. So take a read on what the sort of audience that is. Now you go back and look at, say, 2022, 2023. Yeah, the flag conversation will be much different, but it's just the latest example. And when was it? Last week? It was 13th of September, so last month. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now. Yeah, another recent example of an event where you'd expect to see this breakdown of different flags. You're now seeing an evaporation of public support or concern. It doesn't hold the mind of the public like it once did. It's it, Ukraine's lost part of the support base it had and should really be considering peace because it doesn't look like the support's coming back. Um, yeah. All right, that's enough about them. Let's move on to, well, since I mentioned Palestine, we had coverage at the end of last week about Trump's 20-point plan for peace in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza. So at the time over the weekend, the deadline was for Sunday. Over the weekend, Hamas said they'd accepted some elements of the plan and would return all hostages. So there's elements of that 20-point plan. And to be fair, when you read the 20-point plan, clearly it was favouring Israel, and Israel had some say in it. Apparently, um, the whispers were that the original plan Trump had would have been harsher on Israel, but Israel got in and were able to get some adjustments made, some accommodations made, and presumably now that Hamas is looking at it and making adjustments too, that there'll be a further refinement to the 20 points that were presented. So, yep, still major disagreements that required further negotiations. Well, not a surprise. It basically said that they were going to stop existing. The so yeah, the announcement obviously over the weekend was that Gaza, so that was that Hamas had agreed in principle to hold sections of it. However, other parts they still needed to negotiate on. The initial deadline passed, um, and Trump basically said that uh, if they didn't accept the peace plan, basically Israel was going to be stomping them into the sand. I guess is a way to look at it. Out of the initial hostages taken, are believed to be 48 left, but only 20 still alive. Mm. The it's getting closer. Um, the article's floating around at the moment saying that they're now holding indirect peace talks between Hamas and Israel in Egypt. So presumably they're sitting in different rooms and a mediator's going between them. Have you ever seen a court mediated mediation? A bit like that. You put people in different rooms and you run back and forth with the mediation agreements. Um, but the important thing is they're talking and that there's agreement in principle. It's 2 years since the October 7th attacks, and I think people are feeling a little bit sensitive about it, quite rightly. There's been an effort, well, spontaneous Palestine protests around the place are basically being told to shut up for a day. Um, the There's an attempt to have a protest in Sydney at the Opera House, in front of the Opera House, and there's been a lot of pushback on that. I guess we'll see in the news today, tomorrow, what's happened. But um, it's also the idea that after the peace plan was put out, that we saw ongoing protests, that people were saying, well, look, there's the desire is not there. It's not for peace. It's one of the most workable peace plans that's been around for ages. But yeah, yeah. So here's hoping that they continue to get progress on that. Right, on to other stuff. The blackouts in Spain and Portugal earlier this year. There was a suggestion, and I have heard from a number of sources, different sources, that the reason for the blackouts was a large part due to poor integration of renewables into the grid, the infrastructure. They've put out a report um, that said, yep, the widespread blackout was the most severe in Europe in the last 20 years. And the reason, now, the Association of Electric Grid Operators did the report, so obviously they're going to be biased in their own way. It was because of overvoltage in the network and led to cascading failures, and people died because of it, etc., and so on and so forth. Uh, Power systems and everything else, over voltages cascaded and shut down. I mean, the US, well, the US has had a series of failures. One, ice on the wires. One what was the one in Texas? Cascading failure as well. Uh, but anyway, investigations from different by the government as well as power and grid companies. I didn't realise until recently just how split or divided politics was in Spain. I mean, I knew Basques had always pushed for their own region. The Catalans had been doing so to a lesser extent, but I didn't realise there was a conservative slash liberalised split as much as there was, and that um, it's not as smooth as it might appear on the surface. So, yep, they did the investigation. Obviously, there's different groups complaining. Um, the main provider and the private firms insisted they weren't to blame, blamed the blackout on coal, gas, and nuclear power plants to maintain appropriate voltage, which um, the utility said it's poor planning from grid operators, so blaming each other. That um, collecting complete high quality data proved very challenging, so people didn't want to say what was really going on. The final report for the first quarter of next year. It triggered the outage triggered a broader debate about Spain's energy model. The opposition suggested an increasingly heavy reliance on renewables could have been a factor, and in fact, that was one of the main things that was going around the traps after it had happened. That because renewables aren't don't provide a very consistent base load, you need your other systems to fill in the gaps when that happens. So when you come back up here to the statement here of where was it? The statement that here we go. The blackout on some coal, gas, and nuclear power plants failed to help maintain appropriate voltage. They're basically admitting, without saying as much, that there was an issue with the other power generation on the network that wasn't stable enough, and these more traditional systems couldn't keep up. So the idea that people are saying, well, it's the renewables that caused it. Well, I mean, fundamentally, but depends on where down the pipeline you point the finger as to what was caused it. And so the government said, no, no, it's rejected and careful to avoid taking sides. Well, they just did. So, and it didn't help that power plant shut down during the blackout as well. It caused issues. But it'll be interesting to see who gets blamed as it moves forward. And yeah, it's certainly a concern for people that, well, high levels of renewables in your network um, don't provide a steady supply, which the grid needs to stay viable. and it's hard to balance that. So it's one of those things. And g'day third string, thanks for the lurk, mate. All right, this popped up this morning. I thought it was interesting. I mean, Russia's been blamed for trying to poison people around the world and do all sorts of bits and pieces. Uh, that the spies do this, spies do that, and then MI6 comes out and says we're recruiting for spies inside of Russia, and everybody does it. You can't sit there and claim a moral high ground when everyone's doing exactly the same thing. The thing that stood out about this, well, Bashar al-Assad's probably got a lot of people who don't like him, but the the fact it's suspected poisoning. Um, Poisoning is a method that Russia's been alleged to be using, polonium poisoning, etc., as a favoured method of sending messages to dissenters that Russia can reach them. The fact that so Assad was extracted to Russia as Syria finally fell, and that um, Assad was actually in his protected villa when he fell ill. So he's been released. He's back out. Um, but went in critical condition on the 20th. He was poisoned while at home, which is heavily guarded, reported to be heavily guarded, and that whilst his movements are restricted, there would have been many visitors. It's possible that the poisoning was incidental because of food or water or whatever, but the immediate suspicion is that there was an intentional poisoning and that only the party that carried out the operation knows whether to kill him or to embarrass the Russian government. Claims that the Russians have had nothing to do with it. I mean, the easier ways to get rid of him. And the report suggests it may have been intended to implicate the Russian government, well, because it's a method commonly used by Russia, or allegedly commonly used by Russia, and to show that Putin's incapable of protecting him. Yeah, that's certainly interesting. I don't know if there's comments that are going to show up. Probably not. Okay, so that's all of that. Um, we'll check out a couple more things. All right. The Australian Prime Minister has received an alleged death threat via Facebook. I would be surprised if it's only the one. Sort of thing that I'd expect, well, politicians to get routinely. We had articles in the last couple of weeks about how he's now been forced to shut down his electorate office in Marrickville because of persistent protests by pro-Palestinian protesters and I guess other groups as well, and that it's getting to the point that his constituents can't safely get in and out and do what they need. And so now Albanese renewed his plea to Australians to turn down the temperature after a Queensland man was charged for allegedly threatening to kill him on social media via Facebook. Now, Facebook, oddly enough, when bad things happen in the world, like really, really bad things happen that are allegedly organised via social media, Facebook tends to avoid being shut down or have its operations suspended temporarily, sort of thing. When the Christchurch mosque shooting took place, people in the aftermath banned 4chan from being visible at various places and stuff. The thing was, 4chan didn't have necessarily advance notice of what was going on, or the boards in 4chan didn't have advance notice. They prevented the attacker from live streaming on 4chan. And so uh, the idea that it's being shut down when they were the social media site, they were the site that prevented it, I, yeah. He ended up streaming on Facebook. Facebook wasn't shut down in the aftermath. There was no suspension of service because of what was put on the network. No, they went after an unrelated site because they don't like the sort of content that appears on 4chan. But anyway, that's enough about Facebook. So maximum penalty of 10 years. Uh, we've seen in other countries public figures targeted. Well, yeah, the US and UK, they've had politicians killed, unfortunately. Um, and Australia just doesn't have it. We've had the occasional political type assassination, but not really of politicians. I mean, our old Parliament House, the Prime Minister's office was visible from the street. You could see the PM walking past. So, um, no one is trying to stifle free speech, but the level of threats have elevated substantially. It means change is what I'm able to do and how I'm able to do it. Um, People are being radicalised for increasingly complex reasons. That's an excuse. Threats against the PM were substantial. Well, again, don't necessarily like all the comments, but um, yeah, threats not necessarily Australian. The older comments, though, saying that well, Albanese's responsible for a lot of the divide, and that um, the actions of the e-safety commissioner and everything else is a left-wing government attempting to curtail free speech, and that it's not a mistake, that it's being done deliberately and for calculated reasons. And um, yeah, people saying they're stifling free speech doesn't mean that every site is shut down. I mean, like I said, Facebook gets away with stuff being published on their things all the time. But anywho, all right, we're going to stick with a couple more global events. Last week, when I was talking about Madagascar's Gen Z protests, again, it seems like your protest doesn't go anywhere if you don't have 19 protesters shot and killed. But I pointed out then, and even it was the subject of the video that I clipped, which was, is it we getting Gen Z protests, or is it just disaffected Zoomers? Sorry, it's the disaffected Zoomer spring. It's not an Arab spring; it's the disaffected Zoomers. So, yep, Kathmandu dilemma. So I wasn't aware that some of these other countries were coming up. So I said Madagascar had protests, and we were unlikely to see follow-on because sadly there's not a lot of coverage of Madagascar events. Morocco has now been suffering protests, mostly students and unemployed graduates. Protesters are demanding sweeping reforms in healthcare, education, and social justice. Are you saying that Obama's Arab Spring was a failure? Hmm. No, we can't say that. Well, we can. So yeah, money going into supporting the World Cup, that should be going to support everybody else. Uh, yeah, youth unemployment at 36%. Probably a good reason people are upset. And nearly 20% of graduates upset. Yeah, I can get it. And having several women die after C-sections. Oh yeah, okay. It sounds like there's valid reasons, but well, they've killed 3 in return and hundreds injured. Well, okay, maybe that's why no one's paid attention because they haven't killed enough. It needs to be 20. I don't know why. It just seems to be that that's that magic number before people start paying attention. Attempting dialogue and discussion, the protesters demand government resign. Now, Madagascar, yep, I talked about that. The government collapsed there or resigned. South America. So Peru, the protests have started. after reforms to a pension law, and then wider calls for stamping out corruption, repression, and crime under Boluarte. I think that's the correct way of pronouncing it. Approval ratings to 2.5%, and the government only at 3%. Wow, sounds like it's a US government. But wow, that's if your approval ratings are that low, surely, surely there's a way to step it back. Now, as I scroll past, yep, this is the Peruvian protest. The One Piece, it, it boggles my mind that for years no one really cared about One Piece. I mean, people who were into it would really loved it, but the last couple of years, last 18 months, it's just suddenly appeared and hopped into the public consciousness. Not bad. Um, I wonder how many people they were actually willing to sit down and look at the entire body of work that forms One Piece. But hey, look, if it's a common thread. So yeah, Nepal as well. So yeah, last year Bangladesh had protests that led to outings. Um, 2022, Sri Lanka did a similar sort of thing. Well, Sri Lanka had a civil war for many years, and youth protests on a bunch of other places. Uh, so the idea that okay, bleak economic outlooks, priorities are far away from everyday lives, and fears and anxieties sounds like any youth generation. So, kind of in days of liberal democracy, again, that depends on how you define it and the outcomes of like the Arab Spring and everything else. Uh, uh, yeah, they feel shortchanged. Yep, cool, whatever. Digital natives. We talk about different um, the protesters using the technology of the day to communicate. Back when, back before the internet, there were party lines that were being used, party phone lines were used. People would coordinate and exchange information using letters, newsletters, pamphlets, graffiti, street art, well, you name it. It's nothing new. They're just using the technology of the day. It's right. What that says, exactly what that says. So yeah, it'll be it'll be interesting, and it'll also be interesting to see the longer term stuff that comes out of it because you've got issues with um, well, once you've overturned the government, what do you replace them with? And that's what they're finding in Nepal is the people who've successfully got the government to resign are now at each other's throats because they don't know who to put in. I mean, they've got some suggestions, but they're split on where to go next. So, speaking of governments falling, the fifth Prime Minister since 2018. It's the third, one of the other articles I'll pull up. But anyway, basically, the the new Prime Minister is now the ex-Prime Minister. Um, he's resigned, but Macron has asked him to stay on for another couple of days. He's tried to compromise, but the parties, and I talked about this in the first set of articles, that you've got a coalition, an attempted coalition of very disparate leftist groups trying to keep Marine Le Pen out of power. And these leftist groups, the only thing they hate more than the right is each other. And So the idea, the suggestion that they're able to work together and achieve outcomes, nah, not working, not working at all. And so uh, it's making it hard. Yes, it's hard for the Prime Minister to garner support, etc. Um, I will pull up the other article. I mean, Greece and Italy failing as economies was kind of understood. Well, not necessarily understood, but it was understood that they were struggling economies in the EU zone. Didn't know France was so poor. It was so not so poor, struggling so much. Um, so who's going to come next? So he was seen as a Macron loyalist. Uh, question though is the left. Yeah, they've tried pretty much everything, and um, if the socialists come together, I think they're going to be even more hated than everyone else. And so, yeah, I mean, French politics by and large has swung right, like a lot of Europe has. But yeah, it no didn't work. The attempt to the snap parliamentary elections didn't work in 2024. It's a hung parliament, etc. And yeah, um, it's not so much the protests leading to it, the fact that the government can't hold it together. So, yeah, 27 days in the job. This article, I think, talks about the number of. He was only appointed. Yeah, he go fifth prime minister. He's the fifth prime minister in 2 years. So that's suggesting that there's a whole bunch of issues in French politics, and this is the um, yeah, I mean, it's just uh, not helping. And I reckon if there's another election, I can't see these leftist groups holding power, even if they tried to the same sort of coalition. It'd probably fall again. So yeah. All right. So we've covered the French. All right. Going to have a quick look at. We're going to come back to Australian um, infrastructure and social news. We've talked in the previous weeks about access to subsidised healthcare in Australia, particularly the idea of bulk billing and how bulk billing works. Article comes out this morning talking about uh, the reduction or the lack of support for bulk billing by providers. And I mean, I'd talked about it before about the first-hand experience of a number of GPs, offices, clinics moving away from it. And so we've got a GP in Melbourne that's come out and talked about how even though it's a private billing practice, he chooses to take on a small number of uh, bulk billed patients. He'd love to bulk bill more, but he says the costs, it's not cost effective. And that GPs are managing conditions that specialists would normally manage. Well, when you don't have any specialists around, and we saw that, where even Canberra, I mean, Australia's capital, technically it's a regional city, but you've got people having to go to Sydney and Melbourne for psychiatric support. If, yeah, it, it, it it's a reality of living in Australia that anywhere outside the major cities, you're gonna travel or not have support. And so yeah, GPs having to do more. Um, not a surprise, to be honest, but only 12% of GPs can afford to bulk bill all patients. Well, yeah, the cost of running a modern clinic and everything kind of surprising, but the idea that you're spending zero point 0.1 of an hour, 6 minutes with a patient, how is that long enough to get a decent understanding of a patient's conditions, get quality medical treatment inside 6 minutes? I yeah, it says complex mental health needs, drug and alcohol issues, etc. None of these sort of things are quick and simple. Yeah, okay, I get that. And he says that the GP says that he says when he bulk bills, he misses out on money. Uh, yeah, it, it, it's part of the supply issue. We can't get more doctors through the system, and we had to talk about why that's the case too. Where the choke points in medical training systems are that you've got growing population. Australia's now at 27.5 million people. We can't get more doctors through the system. You get more people per doctor. Yeah, there's no way to sustain empathy, compassion, and concentration if you're seeing a new person every 6 minutes. Yeah, burnout or superficial care is almost guaranteed. Well, yeah, it's kind of an unsustainable rate. Uh, so, increase in Medicare rebates, well, that would certainly help. Increase in the bulk billing rate would also help. I guess the providers and it's the head of the RACGP says that yep, there's increasingly elderly patients, more complex needs, etc. I talked the other day about the cost, $100 a visit. Now, yeah, $90 or more for a 6 to 20 minute consultation. Well, I mean, 20 minutes depends on how long it is. I think my GP has their standard is 15 minutes. I think I'd have to double check what their actual billing rate is. But still, you're paying $50 out of pocket to to go and see the doctor for 15 minutes. Um, yeah, it's unsustainable, really, and it's difficult. And the there's incentives for bulk billing, and oh, yeah, uh, and it makes it harder for people lower socioeconomic status, um, complex needs to go and get medical care. It's just yeah, insane, and it drives patients up the wall as well. That's a video. We don't need to look at that one. All right, that was going to be about disparity in heart attack care for women, but I'd rather look at an article. There was a study. Let me just double check. I think I've covered everything else. Yep, there was a study, sticking sort of health related, about the baby bonus. Back in the day, Peter Costello, what was he minister for? Minister for something. 2004. Basically, there was a bonus up between $3,000 and $5,000, depending on when you had the kid, um, per kid, and the incentive was the government was subsidising the birth of children. Basically, I mean, there's a lot of nations around the world have subsidies for having children or subsidised childcare or various elements of raising a kid. So this was an actual payment at birth of child. So there's a think tank's had a bit of a research. I don't know what their alignment is, but it led to an extra 16,000 kiddies showing up, and that saying that a similar program now may not work. So yeah, it started in mid 2004, ran through to mid 2014, and the statement, one for mum and dad and one for the country. I thought it was John Howard that had said it, but no, it was Costello. And so the question, I guess, is how effective was it? And they've now run the analysis or an analysis saying, oh yeah, there was an extra 16,000 kiddies. Um, Women exposed to the policy were more likely to end up with 3 or more children. Okay, you're above replacement rate at that. and an increased long-term family size, not just the timing. Now, the timing of births means, well, basically, I was always planning to have the kid. I'm just having the kid now because I'm getting some money. So they're talking about added kiddies on top of a family that already has kiddies, as opposed to, yeah, we'll just bring that one forward. 250,000 births in the year before the bonus started, 300,000 by 2008, peaking at 315 in 2018. And then it's fallen back to 286,000 in 2023. This is missing some demographic data, which was present in the other articles we've talked about, where we've talked about migration and Australia's population. So the births per mother uh, are reducing much faster. It's not just a straight up, the same number of mothers between 2008 and 2023. Nah, there's more women of childbearing age in Australia, many more women of childbearing age in Australia since 2008. So the birth rate, um, the per capita birth rate has dropped a lot more than that would suggest. So yep, initial payment of $3,000 climbed to 5,000 eventually. And this one's an interesting one. It comes down to one of those things like how much money do you need to be comfortable? Like at what point, how much do you have to earn per year to be comfortable? And then anything in excess doesn't fundamentally change your level of comfort as much as getting to that value first did. So an extra $100,000 a year has less impact than the first $100,000, for example. The study found that between the 3 and the 5,000 values, the $3,000 value was most effective at generating number of kiddies, and um, that various refunds and other bits and pieces had no detectable effect on fertility. The greatest level of impact was on those with less education. So those who didn't finish year 12, so year 10 level, presumably, an 8% increase, and 10% with those with no taxable income. Now, you don't want to race ahead and suggest that these are less educated, lower socioeconomic class, or anything like that. It's entirely possible they're already stay-at-home mothers, in which case you're coming from a family that's got lots of money coming in, because being able to have a single income stay-at-home mother is, well, then again, childcare costs are insane. Uh, and 8% with below median incomes. Okay, fair enough. I mean, they may have always been planning to have kids. 9% increase of births of a third or fourth child. Okay, fair enough. Um, However, the total cost to the taxpayer per kid over the time is $86,000. That's, yeah, interesting. Um, Various supports exist now that didn't exist formerly then. I mean, paid parental leave, not government paid stuff, but I mean, certain workplaces had paid parental leave. Expanded childcare, yeah, well, go and check the wait lists to get a kid on childcare. Uh, uh, yep, but obviously there's criticism of the study suggesting that maybe there's more generous plans that haven't had as effect. Yeah, fertility rates just continue to fall in Western nations. Peaked at 3.5, 1961. That's pretty cool. Um, Now, one thing I did see suggested is that you're looking at these periods of echoes of generational echoes. So you've got your boomers, then um, it climbed again in the 1970s for Gen X as Gen X started being born because the boomers started having kids. And then the problem, though, fertility fell to its lowest level in 2001, just as Gen X moved into prime child-rearing years. And then it increased to 2.02 in 2008, which is just enough, but then dropped again. Um, the issue, and this comes back to another article that was seen previously, is that the average age of a first-time mother in Australia is nudging 30, and there is an increasing number of what do they call them? Do they call them geriatric pregnancies? No, there's another name for it. Pregnancies after the age of 35, which are high risk, to be honest. Um, the Australian women who are having kids are delaying them much later in life, which obviously has impacts on pregnancy and sustainability and viability and all the other bits and pieces. But we're now nudging 30, which wasn't the case a generation ago. And so this idea, we've got this generational echo appearing in the population as new generations come to childbearing age and have kids, is now sliding by up to a decade because, well, they're now having kids at 30 and not before. So it'll be interesting. I don't know. And yeah, there's issues for people who want to have kids can't afford them. Uh, yeah, I mean, but then again, I've read that if you wait until you can afford to have kids, you'll never have them. To be quite honest, I don't know anyone who's got kids who said that they could afford to have them when they had them. Part of life, I guess. So it'll be interesting to see. Interesting to see. All right. Look at the time. No, I think we're about done. I mean, there's a couple other bits and pieces, a couple of other articles. I think we'll wind it up there. We did have um, a couple of other articles out there that we were looking at. One about there's a scientist who was doing some investigation of using nuclear imaging to detect, or using imaging to science, basically, to help identify origin of food supplies, finding that there was mislabeling, misrepresentation of uh, food supplies, and it wasn't linked to just, say, at a species level, if you're talking about fish and things like that, but they were able to actually work out from isotopic responses where that fish came from, and finding there's a bunch of stuff very, very, very much mislabeled, misrepresented. Uh, there's an article about um, smaller housing, smaller home, what's the household? That's the word. Smaller household numbers in terms of number of people living in a home together. That people who are just a couple or even on their own are finding it harder, particularly in regional areas where the houses were generally built for families, finding it harder to access smaller houses, so 1 or 2 bedroom places in country towns. I, I'll be honest, I think the towns I grew up in, you might have had maybe 5% of the houses were 2 bedroom, where anything less than 3 or 4. Yeah, no. But then again, even the 3 or 4 bedroom places I lived in growing up, I slept in a veranda, on a closed-in veranda. I mean, the house initially was probably a 2 bedroom, but yeah, everyone expanded them for the number of families they had. Uh, and there was a bit of a prisoner's dilemma where a bunch of people had got together to sell a big parcel of land, basically sell all their houses all together to a developer, so they could put a tower block on the land. Developer got stuck with approvals, and eventually the prisoner's dilemma kicked in, and people started taking individual payouts, and so um, the coalition fell apart, so to speak. And I think, yeah, that's basically it. All right, we will definitely close things out. Today was pretty good. So next stream, I'll put some tunes up. Next stream is going to be tomorrow night. We're looking at continuing Pillars of Eternity during Spooktober because there's horror elements of it. I'm currently doing my best to get through the Siege of Craghold, badly, and so we'll look at that. Next Just Chatting stream, probably going to be, I was going to say Thursday, Friday. It'll be Friday. I'm busy Thursday. So if another one goes ahead this week, it'll be Friday. And then Friday night is Prince of Persia Warrior Within, Saturday and Sunday Subnautica, and next Monday continuing with Extreme Exorcism for Spooktober. Aside from all of that, big thank you to everyone coming out and people supporting the channels and the various points at which this gets distributed. Thank you very much for being here and supporting it all. And we look forward to seeing you all again next stream.